dream of a classroom where learning is natural? Can we inspire students to lifelong learning? What exactly is the purpose of an education? Inspiring students to be curious, independent, practical, inquisitive, creative, respectful, trustworthy, innovative, deep thinking, confident, proactive, collaborative, determined, educated. Rise to the challenge of changing the world. This is teaching. This is learning. This is who we are. Welcome to the Tabletop Inventing Podcast.
My guest today is David Thornburg. Dr. Thornburg has worked in the field of educational technology since the early 80s. His focus is on STEM education, and he is a strong proponent of tinkering as a pathway to helping children learn about engineering. He is the co-author of the book, The Invent to Learn Guide to 3D Printing in the Classroom, which is aligned to both the next generation science standards and Common Core math standards.
So let's start off today by asking you, David, to tell us a little bit about yourself as an educator.
Well, I came into education from the back end. After I got my PhD, I was working at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center as a research scientist and inventor. And a couple of years later, my son was born, and there's nothing to get you interested in education as having a kid. So my interest in education really started because of him. And once I fell down that rabbit hole, I've been focused on education almost ever since. And I've taught mostly at the university level, but also hang out with kids whenever I can. And down in Brazil, have worked with middle school kids and whatnot. It's just, I love hanging out with bright young minds and showing them ways to express themselves and to learn stuff through their own creativity.
So can you give us kind of a broad strokes view of education or the state of education as you see it right now?
Well, what I see happening right now, Steve, is really positive. We're coming out the back end of a dark period in the United States that was epitomized by No Child Left Behind, because a lot of people interpreted that to mean that you had to teach to the test, and that if it wasn't on the test, it just didn't get taught. And that's a bit of an overstatement, but there's more truth to that than I'd like to admit. And a consequence of that was we had a bunch of kids who've had 12 years of NCLB education, No Child Left Behind education, who suddenly find themselves in college not very well prepared for a world where education is more open, more flexible, where they're expected to be more creative and better problem solvers. They're really great at memorizing stuff and in passing standardized tests, but it doesn't mean that they truly understand at a deep level the things that they're learning. Now, the reason I say that this is a positive time is because we've got some new standards. The next, to me, the one that's the big one is the next generation science standards, which encompasses not just science but also engineering. For the first time in the United States, engineering is part of the K-12 curriculum for the states that have adopted those standards. And what the overall approach has been is to say in the past we had a curriculum that was a mile wide and an inch deep, and now we're going to focus on narrowing that into core ideas and then explore those with great depth. I think it's a very smart move to make. Also, it's not just about having kids learn about science, it's about having them learn how scientists think, or to learn about engineering, but to learn also how engineers think. And that has also rubbed off into the Common Core state standards, which are different ones relating both to mathematics and to language arts. So the big shift that we've seen, the way I'd like to talk about it, is that we've shifted from a noun-based curriculum, the stuff that you know, to a verb-based curriculum, which is what are you able to do with what it is that you know. And that really is the cornerstone of progressive education. I mean, Dewey said, I don't care what a child knows, I care what he can do with what he knows. And so that to me is something that we should celebrate and be very excited about. It's also a challenge, though, because teachers who are coming off of this other educational model need as much help and support as they can possibly get. They need the staff development. They need people to help them make these transitions, and schools have to really be sure that they get that, because if they don't, these standards will get co-opted, and that would be a really bad thing.
So with all these changes happening, how are we approaching this from a practical perspective? How are educators across the country and administrators and systems? How are they coming at the problem? Are they understanding how this shift should occur?
I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, there are some people that have just said, "Thank God, we can go back to doing what we've always known was the right thing to do." And in fact, those people never stopped doing the right thing. It's at some level, it's just that they couldn't be very public about it. But now, it's like all the things that I truly believe about education are back in the popular vocabulary again, and so I really am happy about that. But there are other schools and other parts of the country where people are skeptical of these kinds of changes. And so as I said, it's a mixed bag. Some people are ready for it, and others aren't. And I mean, some states have said we're not going to sign on to these next generation science standards, even though they're national standards. Some states have even said we're not even signing on to Common Core, even though their federal funding, as I understand it, is at risk if they don't. So you think, wow, what's that all about? I mean, why are people fighting this stuff? And I have to say, Steve, I'm not a huge standards fan, but compared to what we've had in the past, this stuff is looking pretty good. And I don't know why people are fighting it, because it's the ultimate beneficiary of it is our children and ultimately the country.
Well, I think you and I are definitely speaking the same language on this, because one of the things that I ask people all the time is, when students can just go on Wikipedia and improve their IQ points by about 20, how do you really inspire and measure achievement? Like, what is achievement in that framework?
Well, right, and I mean, to me, the whole one of the things I've said for years is, I mean, to start with, any educational system that's based on memory is certainly at risk in a world of universal access to the internet. But that said, just because people have access to the internet doesn't even mean that they know how to use it effectively. And for the longest time, I've said that there are three basic skills that people need to have. One is to figure out how to find stuff. The second is how to figure out if what they found is accurate. And then the third is to determine if what they found is relevant. And these types of search strategies are things that we have to help kids learn, so that even when they're using the internet, that they're very effective in their use of it. They can use it in some good ways. And there have been some studies on this that have been pretty interesting. I mean, that they've taken college kids, freshman kids in college. There was a study done at Northwestern University where they took college kids, actually from another university, and gave them a series of questions on using the internet. And they found that even though these people all said that they were internet savvy, they really didn't know how to use it to get verifiable information that would be germane to their courses. And so these are skills that have to be taught. And if we don't teach those, then we can't assume that just because kids have access to the internet that they are learning a lot. There's an interesting mythology that was running around for some years, the idea of the digital native and the digital immigrants. And, the digital natives are the ones who grew up with all this technology, and the immigrants are the old folks who grew up in a time where it didn't exist. And the implication was that the natives had this all under control. Well, research is showing that that's not true at all. I mean, you could become real facile at Facebook and a bunch of other things, but when it comes down to establishing whether or not a particular historical event happened the way your textbook says it did, that's a completely different set of skills, and it's something that we need to spend more time focusing on. So there's two aspects in answer to your question. First one is, as I said, if you're using the internet, know how to use it properly and effectively. And the second is, how much time are we spending just getting raw information crammed into kids' heads versus having them do stuff with this information, building and adding on to the knowledge themselves. And the way I like to refer to that is through the concept of Google-proof questions, asking questions for which Google isn't the answer. And it turns out that these are trickier kinds of questions with which to come up, but boy, they're really powerful when you can find them, and they result in some very spirited conversation among students and teachers, and some deep learning takes place, because there's no one source that students will be able to go and say, oh, well, the answer is this. And that all ties into the core of project-based learning, which then gets back to Dewey's concept of not just what a kid knows, but what a child can do with what he knows.
We've been dancing around the core question that we always like to get to in our podcast, and that is, so given this backdrop, what is the purpose of an education?
Well, to me, the purpose of an education is for people to be able to, to thrive, to thrive in their communities and in their lives. And some of that relates to local area things, and some of them relates to global issues. The purpose of an education should be to equip people with the requisite skills that they can make informed decisions, and understanding that some of us may make different decisions, but at least we're operating from our perspective with the best information we've got. And I guess Jefferson said that the purpose of an education is, well, he put it this way, as I recall, that you can't have a democracy without an educated populace. And I think there's some truth to that. So at the core level of purpose of education, it's how do we have a functioning democracy? And that's a very deep and very important rationale.
You added a key word in there that I don't hear very often. You said functioning.
Yes, right. Yeah, but
because it's not particularly functioning if people aren't participating, I suppose, or at least not in a meaningful way.
Right. Yes, and again, it's not that everybody has to agree with each other, but that when they disagree. They can argue their positions based on data that they've got and on their core beliefs that have some foundation, and I think that's important. I mean, we've got so many issues facing us on a global scale right now. I don't even like watching the news anymore. It's like every day there's just some amazingly tragic stuff going on in the world. And this part of it that isn't man-made is natural disasters and everything else going on. And you have to believe at some point that human beings can play a huge role in fixing or at least moderating all of these bad things that are going on. if we just were to put our minds to it. That requires an educated public, and it requires a public that's engaged in the process.
I completely agree. So with that purpose, how do we come at this in practical ways? Like what are the practical approaches we can take to rise to that purpose?
Well, I mean, within the classroom setting, we give lip service to critical thinking skills, but the fact is we have to take steps to reinforce students' capacity to take a challenge, gather the information on that challenge, and then from that create a position from which they can argue with some sense of awareness of deep awareness about the topic. I think that's important. Now the umbrella language that's being used for the kinds of pedagogical model that makes sense for all of this is inquiry-driven project-based learning, and I think that's a wonderful model, because what it does is it takes the teacher away from this huge responsibility of being the font of all knowledge in the front of the room, and shares that responsibility by putting the kids in charge of their own projects and coming up with their own insights and ideas, and then sharing those projects with their colleagues, where they are open to criticism and suggestions and improvements and everything else. And I think that's really good. But the argument against that is, when you take a look at real project-based learning, some of the textbook publishers who have a vested interest in staying in business would say to themselves, well, geez, what role do we have to play if teachers aren't going to teach to the test or teach what's in a textbook? What role is there for us to play? And I think that there are some publishers that would be, for personal reasons, concerned if we were to move headlong in this direction, and might provide some resistance to it. I'm sure that they'll find other ways to keep their doors open, so I'm not worried about them long term. But it certainly is requiring some new thinking on their part, and I'm sure that there are publishers today who are thinking very deeply about that topic and saying, how can we support these pedagogical transformations on behalf of all of our children?
So here at Tabletop Inventing, we're quite passionate about a term that I know you and I have freely used quite a bit, and that's maker education. So how does maker education fit in with this inquiry-based, project-based learning that you were describing?
Well, that's a terrific question, Steve, because one of our colleagues up in Canada, Peter Scaling, I don't know if you know him, but yeah, Peter's a great guy, and he did a blog about a month ago talking about tinkering-based learning, okay, and which is a step beyond project-based learning. It's tinker, you just get in and you muss around with stuff, and then out of that you're going to start learning things. And in our 3D printer workshop, one of the first activities we have teachers do is we toss them in the deep end of the pool with a design challenge that happens to be a life and death challenge on a fictitious space mission, where they have to design a plug to take care of a hole that's been punched in the side of a spaceship by a piece of space debris before all the oxygen gets sucked out. And they have to design it with software, and they have to print it on a 3D printer. And when we've done this with kids, we don't even tell them what software to use. With grown-ups, we said, well, we're going to suggest that you use SketchUp. But right away, they're trying stuff out. They're tinkering. They're working in groups. They're saying, gee, this doesn't work. That doesn't work. Oh, but look at this, and this looks like this might work, and they're out there making measurements, and then lo and behold, they come up with design, and they print it out, and it looks like the problem's solved, and so they've reached success. And after they do a project like that, we ask them, what subject areas did you explore? And the answer is, oh, well, we had mathematics, we had physics, we had, all these different engineering, we had all these different subject areas. They were all explored in the context of this single project. And I said, well, but did you teach any of this? No. Did anybody teach it to you? No. Well, that's an example of real tinkering-based learning. That's deep into the pool stuff. And Gary Steger does his whole workshops largely that way. I mean, Norma went to one of the ones he did at IFSI, and it's like, okay, well, here's a station for people who want to do this kind of stuff, and here's a station for people who want to do this kind of stuff, and you just feel free to move around and explore whatever it is you want to explore whatever it is you want to explore. And people will gravitate to things that challenge them. That's the thing that I think we shortchange kids sometimes by thinking that if we don't push them, they won't try tricky things. Fact is, left to their own, the challenge is that kids will try something that may be a little too tricky for them, and then we either have to help them redefine their project so that they don't get overly frustrated, or provide some other resources for them so that they can be successful. But this idea that if we don't teach it, it won't get learned, I just don't think is true.
Well, that's probably going to take a lot of unlearning for us. I think you and I probably went through a whole schooling approach where the person at the front of the room was very much a part of that learning process. Although it runs in my mind that wasn't true for you. That was true for me, but what was your schooling experience like?
Well, I'll tell you, I didn't know this at the time, but when I got to high school, well, to start with, my up through the middle grades, I was not a good student, and in fact, I'd been identified as mildly mentally retarded. Okay. Okay.
Wow, that's kind of brutal.
Yeah, that's kind of tough. Well, and that was because my attention wandered and, whatever. And so I ended up at a Votech school in Chicago that also had an academic track in it as well. And it's called Lane Technical High School. Well, it turned out that Lane Tech was the second oldest school in the city of Chicago. And the founder of the school, Albert G. Lane, was a colleague of Francis W. Parker, who ran, at that time, the lab school at the University of Chicago, and had worked, I guess both of them had worked with Dewey. And Parker was interested in the academic schools, and Lane wanted to do a school for kids who may not go to college. And so he created what we now call Lane Tech. And when I was there, it's now a co-ed school. When I was there, 6,000 boys. It was an all-boys school. And I had my day was filled with shop classes and academic subjects. And everything was taught in a contextual manner. And what that meant is you started out, every freshman had to take mechanical drawing. We didn't have CAD programs. We didn't have computers at that time. So everybody had to take mechanical drawing. Then the next course that you took as part of that sequence was plane geometry. And suddenly now all those shapes that you've been drawing in mechanical drawing, you understood the mathematics behind them because of the things that you learn in geometry. And that was a beautiful approach because you were motivated to learn this stuff because you'd already been using it. And they actually structured the entire 4-year curriculum with that attention to detail. And as a consequence, when I graduated from Lane Tech and I started my undergrad work at Northwestern University, Northwestern University in electrical engineering, I changed majors because all the engineering courses, all the electrical engineering courses I was taking, I could ace the finals on the first day because of what I'd learned at Lane. Okay, so I thought, wow, I'm not being challenged at all. So I changed majors, ended up in engineering sciences, and it was a smart thing for me to do. But it speaks volumes to that school.
So I'm looking at the story from beginning to end, and I see that through the process of making and building things, this Lane School took a student who, by all accounts, was maybe not interested in school or not excelling in school, put things in context, and suddenly you became very interested in school and very interested in the projects, and as a result decided to go on eventually to get a PhD.
That's right.
I normally don't ask this question, but why don't more people use maker education?
I think for a lot of folks, it's kind of it's still a new thing for them. The word is only coming into the vocabulary now. Dale Doherty's pushing the daylights out of it through Make Magazine and the Maker Fairs and all this kind of stuff, and rightly so. But I did an experiment mostly because our friend Kim Brand had done the experiment in Indiana. I tried it here in Illinois. I went into a hardware store right down the street, and they just acquired some new space, so they don't know what to do with in the store. So I said, this new space. I said, is this where you're going to have your 3D printers and your CNC machines and all this stuff for people to use? And the guy said, what are you talking about? And I said, that's a perfect place for a makerspace. And he said, what's that? I said, here's the deal. You're a hardware store, right? People come in here and they buy parts. They buy things that they make stuff with. But a lot of them don't have all the tools that they need in their own homes. So suppose you made the tools available to people here and they bought all the materials from you. Wouldn't that be a cool thing to do? And he said, yeah. He says, it's the first I've heard of this. And I thought, boy, if the owner of a hardware store hasn't heard of it, what's to make us think that anybody else should have heard of it? I mean, in some sense, Lowe's, Home Depot, places like that, they should be falling all over themselves to build these things. And proof of that pudding is you look at the scrapbooking world. To start with, the maker movement isn't just about the electronic gadgets and things and the physical stuff I like making. I mean, look at the popularity of the cooking shows on TV. It's amazing. There's tons of them, these competitions. And they're fascinating to watch because people are given real challenges and their way to success using materials that were previously unknown to them. And the fact that that's drawn such a huge audience says that there's a pent-up interest in that topic. You go to the scrapbooking stores where they've got the workrooms in the back of the store. In the front of the store, they've got all the materials. And what makes the back of the room important is not just that it's space for you to work on your scrapbook, but other people who are working on their scrapbooks are back there, so you've got folks who can that you can bounce ideas off of. And those are successful nationwide, scrapbooking. In fact, I thought a perfect place for makerspaces would be, in fact, in a shopping center right next to a scrapbooking store. And so, who knows? Maybe that'll happen. But it hasn't caught on yet, and I think that what we need to do is just do everything in our anything possible to get the word out.
Well, David, I appreciate all the efforts that you're putting into this. Between
well, you're doing at least as much, if not more, than I am, Steve. So
Well, I mean, if there were 100 of us, it probably wouldn't be enough. But I mean, we just keep spreading the word. We just keep, talking to teachers and saying these things. I mean, I guess I hadn't. You and I have spoken quite a few times before. I guess I had never picked up that you were actually sort of an at-risk student at one point in your life, and it just validates something that I've always thought after looking at the maker tools. I know lots of smart kids that they've gotten into trouble and their lives kind of went the wrong way. Kids that I grew up with, they're now adults, and I ask myself, why do I have a PhD and they're in and out of trouble all the time?
Right.
But I just think there's so much hope here, and I continue doing what you're doing. We love the books. I love the discussions we have. I love hearing your opinions. And I don't want to keep you any longer. We've had a fantastic couple of conversations here. But before I let you go, why don't you tell our audience how they can get in touch with you and maybe a couple of resources that you have that they might be interested in?
Sure. Well, to start with, I love hearing from your audience, and best way to reach me is through my personal email address. And if they just refer to your name or the show title in the address, in the subject line, then it moves to the top of my list. And my address is dthornburg, DTHORNBURG, @AOL.com. Simple address. You just have to remember it's THORNBURG. And then, of course, our book on 3D printing in the classroom, which is available from Amazon, which is called The Invent to Learn Guide to 3D Printing in the Classroom, is a resource that a lot of people are enjoying. And so I invite people to take a look at that. People who are interested in 3D printing in general and just want to keep their finger on the news in that field, because it's, there's all kinds of breakthroughs all the time. There's a website called 3ders.org, 3ders.org, and I go there at least once a week because of breakthroughs on how 3D printing is being used in medicine, how it's being used, like the SpaceX, the rocket that's going to be taking people up to the space station. I just read last week that they just tested successfully a 3D printed engine in that rocket. That's pretty interesting stuff. So in terms of the awareness of the gee whiz factor of this stuff, it's amazing. And then the other resources too is to say, 3D printing is just part of it. And if you really want to get into this whole inventing world, there are so many other tools to look at as well. It's not instead of, but as well. Certainly Arduinos, and the Raspberry Pi $25 computer, all kinds of other cool tools that can be used as part of makerspaces inside schools.
Excellent. Well, thank you, David, for taking some time out of a Wednesday afternoon for us. We'll let you go, and I just want to say thank you, and we'll certainly be in touch.
All right, Steve. Thank you so much for calling. Take care.
Thank you for joining us for the Tabletop Inventing Podcast, where we are seeking to answer the question, what is the purpose of an education? You can connect with us on Facebook.com/Tabletop Inventing or on Twitter @TTInvent. To learn more about tabletop inventing, visit our website at www.ttinvent.com. Join us again next time when we will again seek to answer the question, what is the purpose of an education?